Okay, this is the JPNIC Talk Lounge. Today we invited the Dr. Steve Crocker to this lounge. Good evening in your time zone, Steve.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Good evening. Good morning for you.
Yes, this is now in Japan it is in the morning 9 a.m. past, and then in your time zone maybe the 8 p.m.
8 p.m. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for joining us and accepting our request. Then I'd like to start with your story about that Steve Crocker. You are quite big figure in the internet. One of few fathers of the internet. And then, moreover, maybe the biggest epoch with you is that you are the first person to write the request for comment RFC in well before. So my first question is that what brought you to computer science? So you are at the UCLA. You are learning the computer science, and then I'd like to know why did you choose the computer science in undergrad school?
Well, it's slightly different from that. I was a math geek. I was the kind of kid who. If I had to go to a party when I was a kid, I would take along a math book so I could read it in the corner.
in a party.
At a party, yeah. I was pretty good at math. I spent a lot of time teaching myself math, learning math, and at the time, it was sort of before there were computers available.
Right.
And then when I was in high school. I got a chance to hang around Computer Center. So in Los Angeles, computers weren't available at school. There were no personal computers. It was before that time. There were only big mainframes.
Yes.
But at UCLA, there were computers. So in the last couple of years of high school, I would hang around at UCLA and spent quite a bit of time learning to program. And then I continued at UCLA as an undergraduate. Mm-hmm. I was a mathematics major, but I wasn't a very good student because I spent all my time programming and hanging around computers. And I was president of the computer club for a while and did a lot of teaching teaching people to program. And so I got pretty good at it from that point of view. This is back in the early 1960s. So pretty early from that point of view.
Yeah, that's correct. In the early 1960, we have the quite huge, quite early stage of the mainframe computers. So right. You got interested in programming with a big computer while you were interested in the math. What?
Yes. Well, it looked interesting. And the more I got into programming, the other thing I discovered is that although I had been very, very good at math as a high school student, mm-hmm. The competition gets to be much harder in college and so forth. I used to win math contests, but when I got into college, I discovered that there were a lot of people who were a lot better at math than I was. So over time, I drifted away from pure math. I still know a little bit of math, but not world class. I mean, there's a big difference between being good at high school and being good in the, in the big time.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that happened to me was artificial intelligence.
Okay.
So I had a really special experience. In my last year of high school, I was also able to take a course or two at college in parallel.
Uh-huh.
And the choice of which course to take, which class to take, was determined mostly by what courses were available at the times that I could get from high school over to the campus. So the course that was attractive, that was available, was Introductory Psychology. So a couple of us took that course, and it was a survey course. It was very, very straightforward. And at one point, the instructor talked about the Guthrie model of perception, and it had 4 axioms. And my ears perked up. Axioms. I know what axioms are. I'm the only person in this room probably who knows what an axiom is, because they're all psych students. So I raised my hand. We were counseled as high school students not to be bashful, which was no problem. Okay. So I raised my hand and I asked a question. I'm not sure how I phrased it, but it was roughly, could you program those axioms and see if the theory behaves the way you think it does? I'm sure it wasn't even that well phrased. I didn't get an immediate answer, but it turned out that the professor very kindly wrote a couple of letters on my behalf. And one of the letters went to somebody at Rand Corporation, which was also in Los Angeles.
Rand, okay.
And the reply was several pages about where to study this sort of thing and what to do. And invited me to come and talk. So I went down to the Rand Corporation. I'm 16 years old at this point. And I talked to this man, and he talks to me about what he and his colleagues are doing, and he gives me a couple of papers. It took about 6 months before I had any inkling of what an audience with Herb Simon was all about. And he gave me papers by Feigenbaum and by Newell. And I was hooked. I was excited. At UCLA, there were not very many opportunities to study artificial intelligence. 1 or 2 things, but mainly I just spent my time meandering through school. It took me longer than it should have because I was in and out of school and I was paying for myself, supporting myself programming. And decided that I wanted to study artificial intelligence. And I went off to MIT and to Marvin Minsky's lab at MIT.
Yeah.
And that was amazing. And it was also opened my eyes about how hard the whole subject is. But I did a couple of things there. I was able to help get a paper written on the first chess program that you could sit down and play, Greenblatt's chess program. And I started to focus on, could you take the thought process involved in programming and document that? So it was the beginnings of program verification, partly from a mathematics point of view, but partly from a cognitive psychology, a problem-solving kind of point of view.
Wow. I
came back to UCLA for the summer in 1968. Vince Cerf, who had been a good friend of mine in high school, had finished at Stanford, and he had come back to Los Angeles. I introduced him to the professor that I had worked for as an undergraduate. He became a graduate student under Jerry Estrin at UCLA.
Yes.
And Estrin and Cerf arranged that I could come back for the summer, and my bank account had been depleted. I needed to earn a few dollars. And I spent the summer in 1968 back at UCLA, fully intending to go back to MIT. And a couple of big things happened during that summer. One is that there was a graduate student conference that graduate students from the ARPA-supported research places were invited to.
Okay.
Up to that point, I had paid no attention to funding agencies.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, I was a kid, and I paid attention to where the research was and what the interesting ideas were, but it never occurred to me to think about where the money came from.
Okay.
And that was early in the summer. That was just shortly after I arrived, and I was able to go. I got sent on behalf of MIT. Vint went on behalf of UCLA, and there were quite a few other very bright people there. And it opened my eyes about the existence of ARPA as an agency. And I hadn't realized it, but that was essentially all of the interesting computer science research in the U.S. at that point, almost all of it.
Okay.
Longer story about ARPA. And then also during that summer, the ARPAnet project started up, and UCLA was the first node on the ARPAnet.
Right.
There were four sites that were selected as the initial sites. Mm-hmm. There had been a lot of planning about the subnet, about the IMPs, and about the long distance lines, and all the queuing and all that. Mm-hmm. There had been hardly any planning about how the network was going to be used, what the hosts were going to do, no design of the protocols. And Vint and I went to a meeting on behalf of UCLA and met our counterparts at the other sites in August of that summer.
Okay.
To think about what we were going to do with this network.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, it became an interesting project. We had a blank slate. There was no top-level design. There was nobody from Washington or anybody else telling us what to do. And it was sort of obvious that you'd want to be able to remotely log into another machine. Yeah. It was obvious that you'd want to move a file, but it seemed pretty pedestrian if that was all we were going to do. Mm-hmm. But we wanted a more general framework for how you could do more complicated computations involving multiple machines. And we also knew that a lot of these machines were in laboratories that were doing interesting things. You had graphics at one place, you had big databases at another place, you had new architectures that were the beginnings of supercomputers. And the question is, could you hook all these things up and that they would work with each other over this network? So, and I want to emphasize that, you know, it was Vint and me from UCLA. We were graduate students, and the other people were the same. They were like graduate students. There were no adults. There were no people who were in charge who had a big vision.
Yeah.
And we decided it would be fun to talk to each other and keep talking to each other. So we made a series of plans to visit each other's laboratories, and we started to kick around ideas. And over the next several months, a few basic ideas emerged, and they ranged from having a building block that consisted of a virtual pipe that sort of hid the fact that it was all packet-based, and you could, from a programming point of view, you just look at it as a bit stream that you could just push things into, and they show up at the other end. And more interesting ideas of, because the wires connecting, the long distance lines connecting these machines were 50,000 bits per second, which was pretty fast for telephone speeds those days, but still much slower than if you were directly connected to a computer. Mm-hmm. And so we thought about, if you're going to have an interactive session with a remote computer, how could you speed it up? Mm-hmm. And one way to do that would be to download a program that would take care of the local interactions as best as possible and only send messages when necessary.
Okay.
So it was looking ahead quite a bit for things that we now do with RESTful interfaces and so forth. Indeed. But it was an idea that was part of our original thinking at that time. And Jeff Rulifson was the key guy.
Right. It is really impressive because that's maybe around 1970, right?
It was 1968, 69.
68, 69. So there is no computer communications kind of concept there, and then maybe you need to invent the communications engineering kind of the piece of the technologies, not only the communication input and output at the local computer, but you need to transmit and receive the data. How did you manage to make that?
Well, you're exactly right. Computers in those days, first of all, the good news was that because we were all in research sites, we had time-shared computers as opposed to batch processors. So we were definitely thinking in terms of interactive computing. But each of the computers was the center of its own universe, and it had complete control over all of the peripheral devices. So there was no natural way to connect them up so that they had peer-to-peer communication. And so that's what we had to sort of think about. And nowadays it's pretty straightforward, but you have you add to the operating system the notion that there might be a device out there that is initiating input into the computer, or that you would initiate output to it, and then you'd have to connect these up somehow. So we had a connection protocol and rendezvous tables where you could match up a request to be connected,
Right.
And all of that. I could go on at great length about it, but it's also published and it's very, very old now, and it all works. But we wrestled with that for quite a while. It took longer than I thought it should to come to some sort of agreement and figure out what the minimum structure was to make that possible, and then to build. So that was another key thing, was we had in mind that there should be thin layers of protocols, and that you should be able to add, you should be able to go around them, you should be able to insert things in between, that it was a building block idea, not a finished product.
Okay.
And after several months of these intermittent meetings where we would visit each other's laboratories, there was no formality. We didn't have any structure. We didn't have any program plan or anything like that. We were meeting in Utah in March of '68, and sorry, March of '69. And we said, we ought to start writing some of this down. And so we went around the table and said, okay, you write about this and you write about that, and so for the key ideas. And then I volunteered not only to write one of the substantive ones, but I said, I'll take care of the clerical aspect. Out of that came the RFCs. And the reason they're called RFCs is because we had no authority. We were not in charge of anything. And I wanted to avoid the possible backlash that if we started writing down things, somebody was going to show up and say, who let you be in charge, or who gave you the authority.
Right.
I was very nervous about that, actually.
Maybe the authority lies around the East Coast, and the West Coast is quite remote from that. Is that correct?
Exactly right. I worried that there would be some adult that would come from the East, either from Washington or Boston, I wasn't sure where, and show up and be quite annoyed that we thought we were doing something. So as it turned out, there wasn't anybody else doing anything, and the ARPA office was watching us and said, that's fine, let them go.
Okay.
And so the initial RFCs we didn't have any way to share them except by sending them by mail, because we didn't have a network yet.
Right.
So every one of these had to be sent by U.S. mail to each other place. And the first several RFCs consisted of the mailing list. And when we added somebody, we sent out another RFC with the new mailing list on it, like that.
Right.
So that was the beginning. And then, of course, the rest is history. It got built, and it kind of worked, and then it got expanded and turned into the internet and all of that.
Right. It is quite interesting. Even I 25 years ago, I was doing something for the internet which is emerging in Japan, and then at the time we have the bunch of the colleagues out there, and then talk quite frankly to exchange the ideas to how to expand our community for the commercial internet at the time. And so such a collegiality sometimes makes much great sense for the developing quite a great idea there. So I guess that such kind of the collegiality among your colleagues in other peer sites, peer universities makes this RSP kind of idea happen. That's my guess. And is it correct?
Yes, exactly. And we were very fortunate because the money for all of us was coming from the same place.
Yeah.
So there was no sense of competition. There was no, we weren't competitors in a commercial marketplace.
Right.
We weren't building products that were going to have to, compete for customers. So there was no natural reason for us not to cooperate. It was quite the opposite.
Right.
And that made a big difference. I mean, in retrospect, I
Right.
look back and I say, that was a very comfortable, friendly environment. Whereas if we were working for different companies and there were people planning what the financial future was going to be, there would be competition for products and so forth. That all would come much later. But in those early days, this was a common enterprise, basically.
Right.
Even though it involved all these different schools and research places.
Yeah. Okay. Another point I have to ask you is that this is the ARPA project, which is the project for the military. In that case, I would guess that the military kind of the research has a quite huge restriction for the confidentiality, but it doesn't seem so.
Yeah, a very good question, and it has an important answer. I'll take you back several years. After World War II, the Cold War with the competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and in the U.S. there was a big push to get into space. And the Army had a space program and the Navy had a space program, and they were competing with each other.
Oh, yeah.
And guess who won? The Russians won. The Russians put up Sputnik,
Okay.
and both the Army and the Navy were embarrassed.
Yeah.
And the embarrassment was very substantial, because if the Russians could put up a small satellite in space, they could put something else much more hostile anywhere they wanted. So it became very important in the U.S. to shake up the research program. And within a very short period of time, several weeks basically, a new agency was created outside of the Air Force, outside of the Navy, outside of the Army, but within the Defense Department. So plugged in at the very, very top level, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. A small research agency called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, was created. And it was given considerable amount of autonomy and bureaucratic latitude to define what's research and to go after it. And the first thing they focused on, of course, was space, and NASA was created out of it. They organized the programs, and then NASA came out of it, and other things came out of it. So that was 1958. 4 years later, there was a focus on command and control.
Yeah.
And at that point, ARPA was both big and small, and I want to explain that in a very careful way. It was very, very small compared to the rest of the Defense Department. It had a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the research budget of the Defense Department, and the research budget was only a small fraction of the total defense budget.
Okay.
So in terms of how much attention from the top, there was a lot of room in there for initiative that wasn't overseen right by the very top level. Within ARPA, even though it had a very small amount of the budget of the Defense Department, it had a very big budget compared to, say, the National Science Foundation or to the civilian side of research.
Right.
So these ratios are very important because it was small enough to have a lot of autonomy and big enough to be able to do things. Let me take it a step further. Within ARPA, the majority of the money was focused on urgent, 5-year, push very hard, make something happen and move on. that were very tightly focused with military and defense needs. But the people running the agency turned out to also have some long-term vision. And they selected a couple of areas for long-term investment at a tolerably low level of funding for themselves. So again, a small fraction of the ARPA budget, but nonetheless important, big enough money to make a difference. The first one of these was actually in the material science area.
Material science.
Material science. And they funded a series of interdisciplinary laboratories around the US. Command and control was the next one. And Licklider was able to make the pitch that if you're going to do command and control, you really want to look not at how do you connect big computers together and do batch processing, but how do you have a very long-term vision of interactive computing, man-machine interaction. And he was heavily connected to the time sharing and even the artificial intelligence and psychology communities in the Boston area as well. So he made a good pitch that the program that should be started at ARPA should be a long-term interdisciplinary program, and the cost of making that pitch was he had to come and do it. So he became the first director. And he funded the AI laboratories at Stanford and MIT and Carnegie. He funded, and other places, he funded time-sharing research. And all of this was contrary to the way that the rest of the agency worked, in that here we're talking not about pick a project, go in, spend a lot of money in 5 years, get out and do something else. This was continuous funding over a long period of time.
Right.
And he actually had a vision of connecting all these computers together, but it was a little early for that. But all of that was part of the vision. And that created this, an office. The agency is divided up into a handful of offices. Each office had its own focus. And that office was called the Information Processing Techniques Office, IPTO. And that's where, that was kind of the crucible or the cradle for a lot of the advanced computer science research in the United States. And by 1965, the vision of connecting these laboratories together started to take root. And then in 1966 and 67, serious planning about how to do that. Bob Taylor was the director of the office. He recruited Larry Roberts. Larry Roberts came down from Lincoln Laboratory and started to make a plan. And then in 1968, the formal procurement got started. And in 1969, the first IMP was installed at UCLA. So that was, excuse me, that was the sequence. And things took off from there.
Wow. It's kind of
but all of that, I lost track of the question that you asked. You asked what it's military, how about secrecy? So part of this long-term vision and doing basic research was, even though the money was coming out of a military budget, there was a deep understanding that you wanted to solve the basic problems first and worry about the application in particular military situations later. And that it was important to have the research be open, and that and so it was all unclassified, no secrets, and even worrying about how do you protect the information in the network was put off for a later time. Rather than try to make that a fundamental at the time. For better or for worse. It had its positive aspects, and there were other complications, but that's the way it was. So the whole thing was completely open. And so when us graduate students were working on our part, we wrote memos and we said they're available to anybody, anywhere, anytime, around the world, no problem, free of charge. and I didn't think hard about what impact that was going to have, but it turned out to have a very big impact because it made
Yes.
the technology worldwide
Right.
available.
Mm. Yeah, that's actually the quite what is saying the philosophy of the current internet was actually set forth in such a quite the sequence of sequence of the coincidence and such a the circumstances of the kind of the Cold War.
Yep. It was completely disconnected.
Yeah.
At least at the initial thing from the Cold War, and now it's a much more complicated world that we live in, but that all worked out pretty well. And as your question asked about confidentiality and so forth, our biggest concern was how do you get this to work at all?
Yeah. Thank you very much. And then such a great start of the ARPAnet, and then it's actually the very beginning of the network working group was the made a predecessor of the IETF, and then IETF is growing. How did you feel? Is that you spoke about this kind of history at your speech at the induction of the Internet Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
You created the social process for the evolving the internet by getting the new people into the process, and then by the disclosure of the every process and document.
Yeah. That's right, and it's one of the really wonderful things that happened, but I wasn't focused on creating the social process as a goal in its own. I was focused on how do we get the work done.
Yes.
And my experience was don't create a lot of formal organization. Keep things very informal.
Yes.
And only create the formality as needed. Now, of course, when you scale things up, then you need a little more organization. I had an experience in high school. So this goes back a few years before all of this. I arrived at the high school where I met Vint, and I discovered, to my complete horror and shock, that there was no mathematics club. How could this be that there was no mathematics club? So I went to see what the rules were for creating a math club, and it was easy. So there were five of us, 5 young boys, no girls, who found each other interested in mathematics, and we created a math club. One of the guys decided that we needed a constitution.
Okay.
So he came in with a proposal for a constitution for this little math club. We spent almost the entire year arguing about the Constitution.
Wow, really?
We got no mathematics done at all. One of the most important lessons in my life.
Okay, that's actually yes. I sometimes feel like I'm doing that kind of things. So I love the pragmatism, and then I love the internet way of doing the business. But sometimes we need to have the formality. We need to have the constitution. How do you think? So sorry, I need to jump into some other topic. How did you feel when you joined the ICANN process?
Well, so ICANN, as you know, let's see. So I was more or less in charge of the RFCs, but I didn't do any editing or anything. I was just assigning numbers. I took a job to go to work at ARPA because that would give me a front row seat on watching the best research in the thing. And as I left, I turned to John Postel, who was also in our group, and I said, "Yeah, would you take care of these RFCs for me?" And he did so. He did a great job for the next 30 years. Over that period of time, big changes in the network, and a lot of formality became necessary on assignment of top-level domains in the domain name system and so forth. And he was doing that on the side while he was also doing research, and eventually it became necessary to create a whole new organization. And so that created ICANN.
Yeah.
I was not involved in that, but Vint Cerf got involved quickly. And right after 9/11, ICANN decided that they needed a security group. And my career had veered from program verification back into networking and how do you prove things about software for security reasons and so forth. So I had become a bit of an expert in security, some aspects of security. Right. And Vint asked me if I would chair the new group that was being created, SSAC, what became SSAC. So I said, okay, well, I'll do that for a little while. I figured he said 6 months. I figured it would take a couple of years. And I agreed. And then a year into that, there was a new CEO, and I figured, okay, well, I owe him 2 years, so that'll make it 3 years total. And things just kept going. And then there needed to be somebody who was on the board as a liaison. Yes. You were there. You knew all of this. So right. The advisory committees got liaison positions. Nobody in our group wanted to do that. They were happy to work on security. They wanted to stay way away from the politics of ICANN. Yeah. And so I'm chairing that group. I'm chairing SSAC, and I also volunteer to be the liaison. So I'm doing 2 jobs there. And then as I got into it, I got more involved in the board activity. And then I had a big problem. How was I going to gracefully get out of all of this?
Gracefully.
And then I got a bright idea. I said, if I get a voting position on the board, you only can do that for a certain amount of time, and then you get pushed out. And so I asked for a voting position, and I got it. And you can only have 3 3-year terms. Yes. So that was my 10-year plan for gracefully stepping down from chairing SSAC.
There is a purpose, and then the means is that doing the non-com appointee at the board. So, interesting. Then you spend 9 years at the board of directors of ICANN, and then I'm really grateful working with me for maybe 4 years, I think, there. Do you have any? What's the most impressive job during your time at the board?
Well, that's a good question. It was a long period, because not only was it 9 years as a voting member of the board, but I had several years before that as a non-voting liaison from SSAC. So I was on the board for an extraordinarily long time, about 15, 16 years total.
Right, maybe unbeatable.
Yeah. Well, obviously, one of the most important things was the separation from the Department of Commerce.
Yeah.
And that was a very big deal. There was the introduction of the new GTLD program prior to that, several years prior to that. We went through several changes of CEO, each one of which was a big deal. During my time as chairman, I was involved in recruiting 2 of them, and then I was involved in interacting with 2 more prior to that. The ICANN has been trying to find its way. It spent a lot of time in the early days trying to justify itself and keep arguing why it should exist and so forth, because there were a lot of a lot of people who were criticizing and saying, you know, why do you exist? We should take this over and so forth. All of that is pretty much in the background. There were some lawsuits that were a big deal. VeriSign came after ICANN very, very heavily in the early 2000s, and so forth. So a lot of history there. One of the things that I paid a lot of attention to is the who is problem. The who is situation was created back in the earliest days of the ARPAnet. We published the system administrators who were in charge of the time-sharing systems on the ARPAnet. And the reason we published those names was so that they could talk to each other and sort out operational problems. So then the ARPAnet turns into the internet, and the domain name system gets created, and all of the who is information gets assigned to the domain names instead of to the time-shared systems. And all of this gets scaled up by a factor of 1 million and transforms a lot. And now we have a whole lot of problems. Privacy issues, accuracy problems, harassment, every sort of thing. And so I spent a lot of time while I was on the board, and I've spent a lot of time since thinking hard about how to fix the who is problem. And that's a subject of a different discussion, which I would be happy to talk with you about, but that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah, right. Right. And the who is problem is a quite long-standing. You know, we had the bunch of discussion even before we encountered a problem with the GDPR, and then GDPR brought us the completely new problem for the who is the registration directory services. Then I actually want to have the RDS as the clue between the cyber world and the real world, and then it is really critical for the operating the internet. But GDPR has been driving us a little bit differently. So it is quite a problem.
So GDPR, I think, is basically a good idea. Privacy is important, but it's very crude. It's very sort of one big force that was applied, and isn't very subtle. It isn't very nuanced in terms of who should get access and how do you control this and so forth. So it made a big change, but it didn't solve the more subtle problem of how do you actually organize and give access to people who should have access, and while not giving access to others. So that's an open area that remains requiring a lot of attention.
Right. Yes. How did you feel about IANA transition? Though that was a quite a long process, but quite remarkable epoch for all of us in the internet.
And ask the question again. How did I feel about
IANA transition in 2016?
Yeah. So I got to watch that. You know, I was right on the inside of that, and I understood all of that.
Yes.
The Department of Commerce, the U.S. Department of Commerce, had been the oversight for ICANN from its inception until then. Yes. It was supposed to have been a short period of time. It was the original plan was 2 years, and by 2000 they would do this.
Yes.
2000 came and went. So finally in 2014, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Larry Strickling, said, "Okay, I think it's time. And we'll just do a quick check to make sure everybody's comfortable with that." The quick check turned out to be 2.5 years.
Yes.
And tens of millions of dollars of legal money, and everybody in the world having an opinion. And at the end of the day, we added one more layer of structure around the outside of the whole thing, the empowered community.
Yes, yes.
And we created a subsidiary called PTI for the IANA operation. I thought, okay, fine, if you want to do all that, that's fine. I don't think we've seen the end of what that actually is going to mean. The empowered community has not actually done anything as a structure yet. Now, they may or they may not over time. But otherwise, the whole thing has moved along smoothly enough.
You're right.
There are other problems that, how effective is ICANN at solving problems? Well, it isn't very. It's mainly a reactive organization rather than a proactive.
Right.
And so that's a bigger issue in some sense, or maybe that's the right answer. It depends upon your point of view. Most of my history has been involved in organizations that are innovative and make things happen. And so in some sense, it's been a change for me to live in an organization that is very conservative from that point of view.
Right. It's actually not creating the new technology, but we are that I can need to react or response to the needs from the users and the society to fit the ICANN service into the new situation. So it's a quite maybe it's meant to be reactive. That's my understanding. So,
yeah, but it means that the innovation has to come from other places, and then ICANN follows along when everybody else has agreed that that's what to do.
Right. It is getting really complicated these days. That we need to have a lot of complex process to get things done. So it is, I think, the current situation which we have on the internet. Do you have any concern, or do you have any hope for the future of the internet? How do you see? How do you perceive the shape of the internet from now on?
Well, as I said, it's much easier to talk about the past than the future. But here's my thinking. We have today some challenges about what's called internet sovereignty, where different countries are trying to assert control over either their own portion of the internet or even other portions of the internet. I don't know where all that's going to go. It's going to be complicated.
Yeah.
But here's a different thought entirely, which is more of a technical perspective.
Okay.
You and I and everybody we know talk about using the internet. How does the internet work? Are we connected to the internet, etc.? I think there'll come a time when one doesn't talk about the internet, because the internet will be below the surface. Everything will be connected, and you won't actually think about it.
Right.
You and I don't talk about whether or not we're connected to the electric grid. Of course we're connected. And we know that there's an awful lot of technology there, and there's standards, and there's a lot of business issues and a lot of environmental issues. But nonetheless, we just take for granted that you can plug in and you're connected to electricity. And I think the same thing will be true of the internet. And as I say, we'll stop thinking about it. All of our devices will talk to each other. We'll talk to our devices, and it won't be. We may have trouble explaining to our grandchildren what this internet thing really is, because they'll just say, "Well, it's there, right? What's why is that interesting to even talk about?" And so that's a prediction for the future.
Oh, right. Yeah, you said the internet sovereignty, and then we are we are now encountering. I think that for the conflict between the Russia and the Ukraine, I felt like we time to time have had this wars between the two countries or three, and then this is the first time for the internet to confront with the war, not a peace. And then sometimes as the internet the internauts who are dealing with some internet coordination, I sometimes want to have something for the addressing the war kind of thing, but it is really hard to. It is maybe for me that what we are doing as the internet coordination is kind of creating the ground or creating the infrastructure where we can cooperate or even conflict each other.
Right.
What do you think?
Well, I don't have anything useful to say in addition, because I think you're absolutely right. But there's a different thing that we can say. You and I are talking in English, which I appreciate quite a bit, because my Japanese does not exist. But it would be possible. It's almost possible now. But it will be possible for you to speak in Japanese, for me to speak in English, and for the translation to take place well enough so that makes it comfortable. It's a very complicated technical problem, but we're getting there. We're close. We have rough translation which exists, but it's amazing how far all of that has come along. So that's one of the things that I think is also possible in the future.
Right. So you have quite a big hope for the evolution of the technology.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now I don't. We've had the benefit of Moore's law, which has made computers cheaper, better, faster.
Yes.
In quite dramatic ways, a factor of 10 every 5 years, roughly.
You are very right.
I don't know how much longer that continues, but but it's it's made a lot of things possible that weren't, as well as advanced research in this area.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Then time is not infinite, and then we need to. I need to close start closing this session. What do you have any? What's my question is? What is your passion right now?
Well, I have two passions, I guess. One is my family.
Oh yes.
I have been very, very fortunate to have a very good relationship with my wife and my children and my grandchildren. But the other is I've put a lot of time, as I mentioned, into thinking about the who is problem.
Okay.
And that's where I'm spending my time these days, mostly, trying to do that.
Right. Thank you. The who is problem. So do you have any potential outcome? Do you see anything concrete?
We have a set of tools and concepts for how to characterize what data gets collected, how it gets labeled, how to assign sensitivity to it, and how to have multiple policies that are set in different places and how they interact with each other.
Okay.
And so we have a fairly complex framework that we're trying to document and build tools, and I'm going to show them to you pretty quickly here.
Oh, okay.
When we finish, but that's the big thing. That's what I've been working on.
Right. It's not really the pure technology, but you are still try to contribute for the social mechanism. Something. So is that correct?
That's right. Although it turns out that there is a certain amount of technology that is very helpful to what we've discovered is that a lot of things that people argue about, we find that they are talking past each other because they're not using. They've got different ideas, but they're using the same words, and there's a lack of precision. So what we've been able to do is to build a technical framework that makes it possible to have a much more careful discussion about the social aspects.
Okay. Yeah, that's thank you very much. I look forward to have some look at your idea, and that's going to be great. Thank you very much for the bunch of the wonderful talks. I have had one question to you. You're a private company named Shinkuro.
Yes.
It sounds like a Japanese word, which is Shinkuro, synchronization. And why did you name your company with this kind of Japanese?
So in 2002, a colleague and I started the company, and we were going to build. We did build file sharing software.
Ah, okay.
And he found the word in a Japanese English dictionary, and it said synchronize, and that was the core technology that we were using.
Okay, yes.
And the domain name was available. Nobody else had the domain name, and so we took it.
Okay.
That was the entirety of our knowledge about Japanese, and so there's no other connection. And we later learned. And you can tell me because you speak Japanese and I don't, but my understanding is that that word doesn't actually mean the kind of synchronization that one uses in files synchronization. You would say something else in Japanese, I think.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, and we learned later that it's a word that sometimes is used for synchronized swimming or for other very strange things.
Right. Yeah, the word Shinkuro is a more meaning of synchronized swimming, and I have no idea what it is called right now. It may be different, but Shinkuro means at the same time. For example, that doing the two things, two person doing the one thing at the same time. Or anyway, it had such a the implication of the synchronization, of course.
Well, it probably isn't the best word for what we were doing. Anyway, we built some interesting software. As these things happen, Dropbox and others became much more successful, and we eventually stopped doing this.
Okay.
But for a while, we had some very, very interesting file sharing software. It was 100% decentralized. There were no central servers.
Wow.
And it was all peer-to-peer and all heavily protected, encrypted, and authenticated. And it would work from laptop to laptop or from desktop to desktop. And you could have a group of 8 or 10 people, and copies would be put on everybody's systems. It was very nice stuff.
Okay.
But there's a long distance from being able to do that to being able to build a company. And eventually we, as we learned, there were other successful products that, which I now happily use, actually.
Okay.
So anyway, that's the origin. But the name, we kept the name, and nobody else was competing for the name. So that was handy. And then every once in a while, it leads to an interesting conversation like this one.
Right. Okay. I guess that you have some sort of the attachment to the Japan or Japanese something. Do you have any?
Well, I certainly have always enjoyed the few times that I've come to Japan. We introduced our children to it, and my son makes regular trips to Japan. He and his wife vacation in Japan.
Very good.
And spent much more time than I have. But we've had a great time every time we've come to Japan.
Okay, that's very good to hear. And then I'd like to ask you to make some message to the Japanese community. You are of course well known to the Japanese internet community, and then maybe they will be delighted with your message to them.
There's a couple of things that I would be pleased to say to the Japanese community. First of all, there's enormous respect that we have for both Japanese society and Japanese technology. You have a very important pioneer, Jun Murai, and very important institutions with key people like yourself that are major contributors to the thing. Another thing that is always evident to us is that you're far more civilized in a way than we are. You're a model of how people get along with each other, and we're kind of embarrassed as Americans to kind of barbarians. So I think quite seriously, I think we have quite a lot to learn. We have our strengths, no question about it, but and we're fortunate to have a land that has many features, many gifts, agriculture and otherwise. But I think Japan as a nation, Japan as a culture, Japan as a society is an absolute jewel. It's a model that not only Americans but everybody can learn from. And nobody's perfect, of course. Everybody has the problems, and I think we just have an enormous amount of appreciation for let's say the Japanese people, the Japanese culture, Japanese technology, and the land. It's a beautiful country, and of course the food.
Yes. Food. Multiple times.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. That's really thank you very much for your kind word and encouraging word. And I think I need to do more to respond to meet to your expectation on the Japanese something.
Good.
Then that's really a great talk, Steve. Thank you very much again for accepting our invitation, and then gave us the fabulous talk of your working history and your thoughts, and then your passion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Say hi to Beth.
I will do that.
Yeah, thanks.